I stepped into the opulent reception in a simple dark blue dress, ready to silently endure one last night of humiliation. I never suspected the groom's wealthy father would recognize my voice from a chaotic, life-altering hospital shift. When my stepsister grabbed the microphone and laughingly introduced me to her hundreds of glamorous guests as just a nurse, she had no idea those 3 words would become the very blade that severed her perfect future. My name is Scarlett Owens. I am 33 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have worked as an emergency room nurse at Kingswell Regional Medical Center. My nights are usually measured in the erratic beeping of heart monitors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the desperate, frantic energy of keeping shattered people alive. Tonight, however, the only thing shattering was the quiet dignity of my own past, hidden beneath the suffocatingly sweet scent of imported white roses. I drove alone down the winding coastal roads of Charleston, watching the ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss give way to the sprawling, illuminated estate of Halcyon House. This was not a venue for a simple exchange of vows. This was a fortress of Southern wealth, a coastal palace designed to make anyone who did not belong feel instantly, painfully small. From the moment I handed the keys of my 10-year-old sedan to a white-gloved valet, I knew I was stepping onto a meticulously designed stage. The air was thick with the salty breeze of the Atlantic and the intoxicating aroma of exorbitant privilege. This was not a wedding, it was a hostile takeover masked by silk and champagne. Local journalists and high-end society photographers were positioned strategically behind velvet ropes, their camera flashes exploding like silent lightning against the grand columns of the entrance. The guest list was a calculated roster of power local politicians with polished smiles, venture capitalists murmuring over crystal glasses, sharply dressed corporate attorneys, and logistics tycoons. They moved through the grand foyer not with the joy of celebrating a union, but with the quiet, predatory assessment of people looking for their next profitable alliance. And at the center of this opulent theater stood the queen of the evening, Madison Vale, my stepsister. She looked undeniably flawless. Her custom designer gown was a cascade of ivory silk and intricate lace that moved like liquid glass under the heavy crystal chandeliers. She wore a smile so perfectly practiced it could have been painted on, her voice a syrupy melodic drawl that charmed every older gentleman and affluent socialite she greeted. But I had known Madison since we were teenagers, and I knew how to read the cold machinery working behind her eyes. Even as she laughed, even as she gently touched the arms of her wealthy guests, her gaze was constantly darting, scanning the room to calculate who was watching her, who held the most influence, and who needed to be discarded. She did not want to be loved tonight. She wanted to be envied. Beside her stood the groom, Preston Carlyle. He was the picture of an aristocratic Southern air, with tailored black evening wear, impeccable manners, and a handsome face that seemed carved from old money. He shook hands with a firm, practiced grip and nodded politely at every congratulatory remark. Yet, observing him from the shadows of the arched doorway, I noticed the slight, betraying tension in his jaw. His smiles did not quite reach his eyes, and he frequently looked out over the sea of faces with a hollow, distant expression. Preston did not look like a man violently in love, eager to start a new chapter. He looked like a man standing on a very expensive chessboard, slowly realizing he had been maneuvered into a corner by forces much larger and far more dangerous than a simple marriage contract. Those forces emanated directly from his father, Russell Carlyle. Seated at the head table of the groom's family, Russell was a man who required absolutely no introduction and demanded absolute compliance without uttering a single syllable. He was a notoriously private, fiercely intelligent patriarch, possessing a sharp, unyielding aura that seemed to lower the temperature of the room. He did not mingle. He did not offer overly enthusiastic smiles to the passing photographers. He simply sat there, observing the swirling party with the calculating eyes of an apex predator. I watched as powerful men approached his table, instinctively standing a little straighter, laughing a little quieter, adjusting their posture before daring to speak to him. Russell Carlyle was the gravity in the room, and the Vale family was doing everything in their power to pull themselves into his orbit. A hostess in a sleek black dress interrupted my observations, glancing at my name on her gilded clipboard before offering me a tight, professional smile. She led me away from the grand centerpieces, away from the glittering dance floor, and guided me toward the shadowy fringes of the grand ballroom. I was seated at a small, cramped table near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. It was the designated graveyard for the obligatory guests. I sat down among distant, elderly cousins and a few bewildered neighbors. We were the people invited solely for the sake of polite appearances, kept far enough away so as not to ruin the aesthetic of the high society photographs. I smoothed the fabric of my simple dark blue dress, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of my stepsister's lifelong contempt. I was not here because I harbored any remaining sisterly affection for Madison. I was here because of a promise I had made to my mother on her deathbed. My mother had spent her final years trying to smooth over the jagged, cruel edges of the Vale family, endlessly hoping that Douglas and Madison would eventually accept us as true family. She had failed, of course, but before she passed, I swore to her that I would not simply vanish into the background. I promised I would not let the Vales completely erase our existence or rewrite the history of our family to suit their hollow narrative. I was here to bear witness. I was here to be the one jagged, inconvenient truth in Madison's perfectly curated fairy tale. Resting on my gold-rimmed charger plate was the wedding program. It was a heavy, magnificent booklet bound in velvet ribbon and stamped with gold foil. I picked it up, my fingers brushing over the thick parchment. I flipped past the romanticized history of the couple, past the exhaustive list of elite groomsmen and bridesmaids, until I found the section dedicated to the families. There, nestled beneath a touching, entirely fabricated paragraph about the blending of two devoted households, was my name. Scarlett Owens, immediate family. A bitter, humorless laugh caught in my throat. I looked up from the page, my eyes locking onto the distant figure of Madison, who was currently posing for the cameras, looking like a patron saint of familial devotion. I finally understood the true depth of the insult. I had not been invited to this table out of a lingering sense of duty, nor out of a desire for reconciliation. I was invited as a prop. I was a name on a piece of expensive paper, a convenient line item used to purchase the illusion of a wholesome, loving family for the benefit of the Carlisle dynasty. They thought I was just a quiet, obedient nurse who would sit in the shadows and let them spin their lies. But as the lights dimmed and the orchestra began to play, they had no idea what was truly waiting for them in the dark. The string quartet shifted into a sweeping classical piece, the notes soaring above the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I took a sip of my ice water, letting the cold ground me in the present, though the heavy scent of the gardenias on the table kept dragging me backward. It is a strange thing to sit in a room bursting with manufactured joy, while carrying the heavy, quiet grief of an entire childhood. My real father died when I was 14 years old. He was a good man with a loud laugh and a weak heart, and when it gave out on a Tuesday afternoon, he left my mother and me with a mountain of medical bills and a void that nothing could ever properly fill. My mother, soft-spoken and perpetually anxious, tried to hold our fractured world together. She worked 2 minimum-wage jobs, her hands always smelling of industrial soap and cheap diner coffee, until the bone-deep exhaustion nearly broke her spirit. We lived month to month, counting loose change to keep the electricity running. Then she met Douglas Vale. At the time, Douglas was not the titan of industry he is today. He was a sharply dressed, ambitious businessman just beginning to build his fortune on a series of lucrative medical logistics contracts. He offered my mother stability, a sprawling house in a gated coastal neighborhood, and the promise of a life where she would never have to calculate the cost of basic groceries again. When we moved into the Vale estate, I was 16 years old. I remember standing in the grand foyer for the first time, staring at the vaulted ceilings, the imported marble floors, and the sweeping mahogany staircase, feeling not like a new daughter, but like a stray dog allowed inside out of pity. I understood the unspoken rules of the house almost immediately. I was accepted on paper, a charitable addition to Douglas's portfolio of good deeds to make him look like a family man. But to Madison, I was an infection. She was the golden child, the rightful heir to the Vale kingdom, and she viewed my presence as a grotesque error in the universe. She made it her mission to remind me every single day that I did not belong in her reality. Our lives diverged sharply under that massive roof. Madison was cultivated like a rare orchid. She spent her adolescence at elite private academies, attending high society charity galas in custom dresses, and summering on secluded private islands where the sun seemed to shine exclusively for the wealthy. Her biggest problems revolved around the exact shade of her lip gloss, or securing the newest model of an imported sports car for her 16th birthday. My adolescence, by contrast, was a brutal exercise in survival. While she was being fitted for debutante gowns, I was picking up extra shifts at a local diner, saving every crumpled dollar bill to pay for my own textbooks. I took out crushing student loans, burying myself in tens of thousands of dollars of debt, because asking Douglas for college tuition felt like signing away my soul. I hauled myself through a nursing program on a diet of black coffee and sheer spite. I worked grueling 12-hour night shifts at a free clinic, cleaning up blood and vomit, and slept a few scattered hours in my rusted sedan in the hospital parking lot before morning lectures. Through it all, my mother tried desperately to play the peacemaker. She would pull me into the kitchen, her eyes pleading, her voice barely above a whisper so Douglas would not hear. She would stroke my hair and tell me that Madison was just insecure, that she would grow up, that time would eventually smooth out the bitter, jagged edges between us. But my mother was profoundly wrong. Time did not make Madison kinder. It only made her cruelty more sophisticated, more refined. The blunt, childish insults of our teenage years evolved into weaponized politeness. Madison learned how to deliver a devastating insult with a pristine smile, how to exclude me from family photographs by claiming the lighting was wrong, and how to make me feel entirely invisible in a room full of chattering people. Then, my mother died. It happened 5 years ago, a swift and merciless illness that tore through her body before I could even fully comprehend she was leaving. I sat by her hospital bed for 72 straight hours, watching the monitors slowly fail, holding her fragile hand as the life drained out of her. The moment her heart stopped, the final fraying thread tying me to the Vale family snapped. Douglas and Madison moved with terrifying, calculated speed to consolidate their power. They swallowed up every ounce of influence my mother had possessed in that house. When it came to the estate, the complex paperwork, and the major decisions regarding my mother's meager remaining personal assets, I was abruptly and forcefully locked out. I was treated as a stranger, a nuisance trespassing on their carefully managed grief. I should have walked away completely. I stood on the precipice of cutting them out of my life entirely, changing my phone number, moving to a different state, and never looking back. But I did not. I stayed tethered to the cold periphery of their gleaming world, because something in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death felt deeply wrong. There were closed-door meetings with aggressive lawyers, hushed, panicked conversations between Douglas and his business partners, and a conspicuous lack of transparency regarding my mother's final medical files. My nurse's intuition, the instinct that alarms me when a patient's vital signs do not match the notes on their chart, told me the Vales were hiding something. I kept my distance, but I kept my eyes wide open, waiting for the inevitable crack in their perfect facade. Now, sitting in this freezing ballroom, watching Madison glide from table to table in her custom gown, I finally understood the true architecture of the evening. She had not invited me simply to witness her triumph or to fulfill a social obligation. That would be far too passive for a woman like her. Madison loved an audience, and she demanded a sacrifice. Amid the cascading white flowers, the heavy scent of perfume, and the soaring melodies of the violins, I realized she was preparing to complete an old, vicious ritual. This wedding was not just a celebration of her union with the powerful Carlyle family. It was a stage built to diminish me, to cement her superiority in front of a brand new, highly influential crowd. She wanted to show the Carlisle dynasty exactly where I stood in the social hierarchy, ensuring that the affluent society of Charleston knew I was nothing more than the dirt beneath her designer heels. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out through the vents. I looked past the towering crystal centerpieces and the flickering candles, my gaze sweeping over the faces of the billionaires, the politicians, and the socialites laughing with their perfect teeth. None of them knew the decades of resentment buried beneath the expensive floorboards. They thought they were attending a joyous, harmless celebration of love, but they were entirely wrong. This room was a violent collision course of unpaid emotional debts, a battleground draped in silk and velvet. I tightened my grip on the edge of the table, my knuckles turning stark white against the dark tablecloth. I had not walked into a wedding tonight. I had walked into an ambush, and the bride was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike the match. The clinking of silver against crystal started just as the servers, moving with the synchronized precision of a military unit, began clearing the gilded plates from the main course. The sound cut through the low, ambient hum of the grand ballroom, sharp and demanding. I sat in the shadows near the kitchen doors, watching as Madison rose from her seat at the center of the head table. She held a delicate flute of champagne, the bubbles catching the light of 1,000 imported chandeliers overhead. The room quieted almost instantly. A sea of 300 affluent guests, the absolute apex of Charleston society, turned their collective, expectant attention toward the bride. Madison beamed. It was that angelic, radiant smile she had rigorously perfected over 2 decades of private school pageants, charity galas, and debutante balls. "Thank you," she began, her voice a soft, syrupy southern melody that she projected flawlessly across the expansive venue. "Thank you all for being here on the most magical night of my life. Before we move on to the dancing and the cutting of the cake, there is one very special introduction I feel I absolutely must make." A cold, heavy knot tightened in the pit of my stomach. I knew that specific tone of voice intimately. It was the velvet glove slipping securely over the iron fist. I felt the sudden urge to stand up and walk out the side door, but I remained frozen in my chair. "We are officially joining 2 incredible, historic families tonight," Madison continued, her gaze sweeping elegantly across the room before locking directly and purposefully onto my dark, isolated corner. "But there is a member of my family who often prefers to hide in the background, out of the spotlight. Scarlett, darling, please come up here." The spotlight, both literal and figurative, swung aggressively toward my cramped table. Dozens of perfectly coiffed heads turned in unison. Billionaires, state senators, and heavily jeweled socialites peered into the dim lighting, their eyes narrowing to see exactly who the beautiful bride was summoning from the fringes of the party. It was a flawless, inescapably cruel social trap. If I refused her public invitation, I would be instantly branded as the bitter, jealous older relative determined to ruin a perfect wedding. If I complied, I was walking straight into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. I took one slow, grounding breath, placed my linen napkin neatly on the table, and pushed my chair back. The walk from the back of the room to the gleaming dance floor felt like marching across an active battlefield. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. With every single step I took past the tables draped in expensive silk, I felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on my simple, unbranded blue dress. I kept my chin leveled and my posture rigidly straight, absolutely refusing to give anyone in that room the satisfaction of seeing me tremble or shrink. When I finally reached the center of the room, standing under the brightest lights, Madison reached out and firmly hooked her arm through mine. Her grip was surprisingly tight, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin through the fabric of my dress. It was a physical, undeniable assertion of total control. She turned to face the Carlisle family table, where Preston and his imposing father, Russell, sat in stony silence. Madison leaned slightly into the microphone, her eyes sparkling with malicious joy. "This is my stepsister, Scarlett," Madison announced, her voice dripping with an artificial, practiced sweetness. She paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the silence hang heavy over the crowd, before delivering the punchline she had likely been rehearsing for weeks. "She is just a nurse." The words hung in the air, a perfectly calculated insult, dressed up in the guise of a casual, loving introduction. A ripple of polite, polished laughter fluttered through the front tables. A few older women, dripping in diamonds, raised their thinly plucked eyebrows in feigned amusement. Several men in custom-tailored suits chuckled softly, offering the obligatory, hollow amusement expected when a wealthy bride makes a joke at a subordinate's expense. It was exactly the social effect Madison had orchestrated. She wanted the most powerful people in the state to look at me and see nothing but the hired help, a biological footnote in her grand, upwardly mobile narrative. But Madison was not quite finished. She squeezed my arm tighter, tilting her head with a high, patronizing giggle that grated against my ears. "Honestly, you all should see her," she continued, addressing the high society crowd as if I were a quirky, somewhat amusing pet she had rescued. "She is so good at calming down panicking people. It is a very handy trick to have around the house, really. If any of you get too stressed about the stock market dropping a few % tomorrow morning, or if your yacht engine stalls, just call Scarlett. She will hold your hand, pat your head, and tell you everything is going to be just fine." She was taking the brutal, blood-soaked reality of the emergency room, the agonizing, desperate hours I spent trying to keep shattered bodies breathing and broken hearts beating, and reducing it to a cheap parlor trick for the entertainment of venture capitalists. I did not pull away from her grip. I did not glare at her, nor did I raise my voice to defend the integrity of my life's work. Instead, I stood perfectly, unnervingly still. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin a fraction of an inch higher, and offered a faint, serene, completely detached smile. I looked out over the crowd with the absolute, unshakable calm of a woman who has stared death in the face and won. I let the terrible silence stretch. I let them look at me, forcing them to digest what had just happened. And slowly, inevitably, the atmosphere in the room began to curdle and rot. My absolute refusal to break, my refusal to act ashamed, angry, or humiliated, turned the mirror back onto the audience. The polite chuckles died abruptly in their throats. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their gilded chairs, suddenly finding the rims of their wine glasses fascinating. The joke had landed, but the venom was entirely too visible, too raw for polite society. People began to realize they were not laughing with a charming, quirky bride. They were participating in a public, mean-spirited execution. Preston Carlyle shifted his weight at the head table, his handsome face briefly twisting into a grimace of genuine, undeniable discomfort. He looked directly at me, then turned his gaze sharply to Madison. He opened his mouth slightly, as if preparing to intervene, as if he might actually say something that would diffuse the sudden, suffocating awkwardness smothering his wedding reception, but his courage failed him. He hesitated for 3 seconds too long, trapped between his inherent sense of decorum and his impending marriage. Sensing the shifting tide of the room, realizing she had pushed the boundary too far, Madison quickly pivoted. She unhooked her arm from mine with a sharp, jerky motion and raised her champagne glass higher, her smile widening frantically to overcompensate for the sudden chill in the air. "To family," she declared loudly, her voice a pitch higher than before, forcing the room to move on. "And to the wonderful, bright future ahead of us. Now, please, let us cut the cake." The orchestra, likely signaled by a desperate event planner, immediately struck up a lively, upbeat chord, a frantic attempt to wash away the heavy tension. The guests clapped loudly, far too eager for the distraction, physically turning their bodies away from the uncomfortable scene. I was officially dismissed. I took a slow step back, preparing to retreat to my shadowy corner, sit in silence, and wait for the precise moment I could retrieve my car and leave this suffocating estate forever. But as the crowd broke apart and the waitstaff rushed forward with fresh champagne bottles to distract the masses, my eyes drifted past Preston's uncomfortable grimace and locked onto the center of the head table. Russell Carlyle was not clapping. He was not looking at the massive, multi-tiered cake being rolled onto the dance floor, nor was he looking at his son or the radiant, triumphant bride. He was staring directly, intensely at me. The calculating, predatory calmness I had observed in him earlier in the evening was completely obliterated. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders tense, his large hands resting flat and hard against the white tablecloth. His eyes, sharp and piercing, were wide with a sudden, jarring recognition. He was not looking at me the way the other guests did, as a pathetic stepsister or a social punchline. He was looking at me like a man who had just seen a ghost walk right out of the darkest, most terrifying night of his entire existence. He stared at me, unblinking, the loud music and the chattering noise of the wedding fading into a dull, meaningless roar around him. In that single, electrifying moment of locked eyes, the entire power dynamic of the opulent room fractured and shattered. Madison had thought she was burying me forever under the immense weight of her new family's prestige and wealth. She had absolutely no idea that by dragging me into the spotlight and mocking my profession, she had just put me face to face with a man whose life I had fundamentally, irrevocably altered. The orchestra swelled, filling the cavernous ballroom with a frantic waltz, but the music felt entirely disconnected from the heavy, suffocating gravity anchoring the head table. I had already taken 2 steps back toward the shadows, eager to retreat to my designated corner, but I could feel the physical weight of Russell Carlyle's stare burning into my skin. He was not just looking at me, he was dissecting me, the formidable patriarch, a man who famously controlled boardrooms with a mere flick of his wrist, now sat rigidly in his velvet-backed chair. His sharp, calculating eyes tracked my every minimal movement. Even the guests seated in his immediate vicinity, a collection of high-powered state senators and aging shipping magnates, began to notice the profound shift in his demeanor. They exchanged confused, subtle glances, their polite conversations trailing off as they followed the trajectory of his intense focus straight to me. I turned away, desperate to break the invisible tether pulling between us, when a sudden, sharp gasp cut through the polite chatter near the edge of the dance floor. An elderly woman, draped in heavy silver silk and a fortune in pearls, had pushed herself up from a chair near the Carlyle family section far too quickly. I watched the color instantly drain from her powdered face. Her knees buckled, her hands grasping blindly at the empty air as the blood rushed from her head. Before anyone else could react, before the gasps of the surrounding socialites could even form into words, a decade of emergency room conditioning overrode my desire to remain invisible. I did not think, I just moved. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid strides, sliding my arm firmly around her waist and grasping her elbow just as gravity threatened to drag her to the polished hardwood floor. I took her weight against my side, steadying her trembling frame with practiced ease. "I have got you," I said. My voice dropped automatically into that specific, low, unshakable cadence I used in the trauma bay. It was a tone completely stripped of panic, designed to anchor a terrified patient to reality. "You just stood up a little too fast. Keep your eyes open and look right at me. Take a slow, deep breath in." The elderly woman blinked, her chest heaving as she leaned into my shoulder. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched my forearm. The room just started spinning. "It happens to the best of us," I replied smoothly, guiding her gently back down into her padded chair. "Just stay seated for a few minutes. I am going to have someone bring you a glass of water with no ice." I looked up to signal a passing waiter, and that was when I saw him. Russell Carlyle had stood up from his table. He was no longer just staring. He was completely frozen, looking at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock. If my face had sparked a vague recognition in him earlier, my voice had just blown the doors off a locked vault in his mind. The polite, superficial mask of the billionaire patriarch was gone. In its place was the raw, haunted expression of a man forcefully dragged back to a moment of sheer terror. It was not my blue dress or my quiet posture he remembered. It was the calm, steady command in my voice. He bypassed his son, bypassed the hovering event staff, and walked directly over to where I stood. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was intimidating, but I refused to step back. "Where did you say you practiced?" he asked. His voice was remarkably low, barely carrying over the sound of the string quartet, but it possessed an urgency that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I kept my expression entirely neutral, keenly aware of the dozen pairs of wealthy eyes now burning holes into my back. I did not want to become the center of an interrogation in the middle of Madison's meticulously planned reception. "I am an emergency room nurse, sir," I answered, keeping my tone polite, but distinctly closed off. "Where?" he pressed, taking a half-step closer. "Which hospital?" "What city?" "Kingswell Regional," I replied evenly. Right here in the city, a profound, dark realization seemed to wash over his features. The muscles in his jaw flexed, and his eyes searched mine as if begging me to confirm a truth he was terrified to speak aloud. Before he could ask another question, the loud, booming laugh of Douglas Vale echoed from the nearby arched doorway leading to the terrace. I seized the distraction. "Excuse me, Mr. Carlyle? I need to get her some water," I murmured, slipping past him and disappearing into the bustling periphery of the ballroom. I navigated through the labyrinth of waiters and catering carts, seeking a moment of quiet near the terrace doors to process what had just happened. Why did the name Kingswell Regional make a man like Russell Carlyle look like he had just seen a phantom? As I stood hidden behind a massive floral arrangement of white orchids, the heavy wooden doors to the terrace pushed open slightly. Douglas Vale stood just outside in the humid night air, holding a glass of scotch and speaking in a hushed, aggressive tone to an older man I recognized as a prominent corporate attorney. "You worry too much," Douglas was saying, his voice laced with arrogant confidence. "The ink is as good as dry. As soon as Madison and Preston cut the cake, we are going to make the joint partnership announcement. The Vale Nexus Logistics Network merges with Carlyle Capital by Monday morning. I just do not like rushing the compliance paperwork," the attorney muttered, sounding distinctly uneasy. "Russell Carlyle is not a man you want to blindside with operational discrepancies." "There are no discrepancies that matter," Douglas snapped. "This wedding is the ultimate collateral. We are family now. He will not blow up a multi-million-dollar merger when his son just put a ring on my daughter's finger." I pressed my back against the cool plaster of the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. This opulent, excessive wedding was not a celebration of young love. It was a high-stakes, socialized corporate merger. Douglas was using Madison's marriage as a bridge to tap into the massive wealth, pristine reputation, and global network of the Carlyle empire. A frazzled young woman wearing a black headset, clearly one of the lead wedding coordinators, hurried past my hiding spot. In her rush, her leather binder slipped, spilling a cascade of crisp papers onto the floor at my feet. I knelt to help her gather them. As my fingers brushed against the top sheet, I saw the official, minute-by-minute timeline of the reception printed in bold black ink. Right beneath the scheduled cake cutting, a newly added line item jumped off the page: special family announcement and joint venture signing. "Thank you. I am so sorry," the coordinator gasped, snatching the papers from my hand and scurrying away toward the kitchens. I stood up slowly, the blood roaring in my ears. I was no longer just the unwanted stepsister invited to endure a night of petty humiliation. I was standing dead center in the epicenter of a massive, fragile house of cards built on ambition and deceit. Madison and Douglas had orchestrated every single detail of this night to secure a fortune. They had used my profession to add a touch of working-class nobility to their family resume, then mocked me to assert their dominance. I looked back out across the ballroom. Russell Carlyle had returned to his seat at the head table, but he was not looking at the bride, and he was certainly not looking at Douglas Vale. He was staring directly into the shadows where I stood, his expression torn between devastating grief and rising, volcanic anger. He knew. I did not yet know exactly what he remembered, but the tormented look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Madison had dragged me into the spotlight to prove her power, but in doing so, She had unwittingly handed me the single, fatal thread that could unravel her entire empire. And as the waiters began rolling the towering wedding cake onto the dance floor, I realized that tonight, that thread was going to be pulled. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom sealed behind me, instantly muting the frantic waltz and the deafening clatter of the reception. I needed air. I needed a moment away from the suffocating perfume and the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers to steady my racing pulse. I retreated down a dimly lit, mahogany-paneled corridor lined with antique portraits, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the estate's sprawling library. Before I could reach the heavy brass handles, a soft voice called out from a velvet settee nestled in an alcove. "Scarlett, is that you?" I turned to see Eleanor Vance, one of my late mother's oldest and dearest friends. She was a gentle, unassuming woman who always looked slightly out of place among the ruthless Charleston elite. Tonight, she looked particularly exhausted, her hands tightly clutching a small, beaded evening bag. "Eleanor," I said, forcing a warm, genuine smile that I had not been able to muster all evening. "It is so good to see you. I did not realize you were invited." "Oh, your mother made Douglas promise to keep me on the holiday card list," Eleanor replied with a wistful sigh. She patted the empty space beside her, and I sat down. "I have been watching you tonight. My dear, you have your mother's absolute grace, I must admit. I was quite surprised by Madison's little joke out there. It felt so incredibly out of step with the lovely things she wrote about you in the family portfolio." I frowned, the muscles in my neck instantly tightening. "The family portfolio." Eleanor nodded, looking slightly confused by my reaction. "Yes, the introductory dossier, the bound biography, the veils submitted to the Carlisle Family Trust Board during the early engagement. Madison dedicated an entire, beautiful page to you. She went on and on about how incredibly proud she is to have a stepsister working as a frontline trauma nurse. She called you the moral anchor of the family." A cold, sharp wave of nausea washed over me. I stood up, my mind racing to process the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy. Madison had secretly packaged my grueling, blood-soaked career into a shiny, philanthropic bullet point to impress her billionaire in-laws. She had used my 12-hour shifts, my exhaustion, and my dedication to scrub her family's ruthless reputation clean on paper. Yet, the moment she had secured the ring and the audience, she used that exact same profession as a weapon to publicly degrade me. "Thank you, Eleanor," I managed to say, my voice eerily calm. "I actually have not seen that portfolio yet." I left her in the alcove and moved swiftly toward the foyer, where the guest book sat atop a massive marble table. Stacked neatly beside the leather-bound book were copies of the extended wedding program, a lavish 50-page booklet detailing the philanthropic endeavors of both families. I picked one up, flipping past the glossy engagement photos until I found the section on the Vale family. There it was, printed in elegant script. My name was listed under a section titled "Contributors to the Vale Humanitarian Direction." There was a fabricated quote about how my work in the emergency department deeply inspired Douglas Vale's corporate philosophy. They had stolen my identity, my sweat, and my tears, converting them into social currency without ever asking my permission. I dropped the booklet back onto the marble as if it were burning hot. I needed to find a place to think, a place where I could not be observed. I walked deeper into the labyrinth of the estate, moving toward the private study rooms reserved for the bridal party. As I rounded a corner, I saw that one of the heavy oak doors was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, golden light spilled out onto the hallway runner. I could hear the low, urgent murmur of voices. It was Douglas Vale, speaking with two men wearing immaculate, conservative suits. They were the Carlisle legal team. I pressed my back against the silk wallpaper, holding my breath, and edged closer to the crack in the door. Douglas was leaning over a massive, leather-topped desk, aggressively tapping his index finger against a thick stack of legal documents. "We are ready to execute the transfer the moment the reception concludes. The infrastructure is solid. We have cleared the regulatory hurdles." One of the lawyers adjusted his glasses, looking decidedly unimpressed. Mr. Carlyle wants a final, comprehensive review of the subsidiary logistics chains. Specifically, he wants ironclad assurances regarding your third-party transport contracts. He does not absorb liabilities. Mr. Vale, he eliminates them. Douglas waved his hand dismissively. Those contracts are perfectly insulated. As Douglas shifted his weight, the heavy folder on the desk slid open, fully exposing the embossed corporate logo on the cover page. The gold foil lettering caught the light of the desk lamp, burning the words directly into my retinas. Vale Nexus Logistics. The air trapped in my lungs suddenly turned to ice. I closed my eyes, and the lavish surroundings of the mansion instantly dissolved, replaced by the chaotic, blinding fluorescent lights of the hospital trauma bay. It was a memory from 2 winters ago. The emergency room had been at maximum capacity when a massive, multi-car pileup on the interstate flooded our department. In the middle of the absolute carnage, we had to receive a critical transfer patient, a woman suffering from severe respiratory failure. She had been transported using a mobile ventilator unit provided by an external, contracted logistics company, but when she arrived, the machine was failing. The oxygen mixture was completely wrong, the valves freezing up because the transport company had blatantly ignored the temperature control protocols to save money on their fleet vehicles. I had spent 3 agonizing hours manually bagging that patient, fighting to keep the oxygen flowing into her lungs while the doctors scrambled to stabilize her. When the crisis finally passed, the hospital administration tried to quietly sweep the equipment failure under the rug to protect their lucrative supply contracts, but I had refused to comply. I filed a brutal, meticulously detailed Sentinel event report. I documented every single failure, every serial number, and every breached protocol. The name of the third-party logistics supplier responsible for that faulty, near-fatal equipment had been Nexus. I opened my eyes, staring at the gold logo through the crack in the door. It was not a coincidence. Douglas Vale owned the very company that had nearly killed a patient on my watch. My professional intuition, honed over thousands of hours of monitoring subtle shifts in human vital signs, was screaming at me. The past was not just knocking on the door of this wedding, it was actively tearing the hinges off. I slipped silently away from the study, my mind working with cold, mechanical precision. I navigated back through the corridors and stepped out onto the edge of the grand ballroom. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The cake had been cut, but the joyous energy had curdled into something distinctly nervous. I looked across the dance floor and locked eyes with Preston Carlyle. The groom was standing completely alone near the bandstand. He was no longer playing the part of the polished, happy heir. His jaw was clenched tight, his posture rigid with sudden, undeniable suspicion. I watched as his gaze darted from his father, who was still sitting at the head table with an expression of dark fury, to his new bride. Madison was standing near the towering cake, holding a silver server, but her smile was entirely gone. She looked frantic. She kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes darting between where I stood in the shadows and where her new father-in-law sat. When Douglas emerged from the hallway a moment later, his face flushed and his brow gleaming with nervous sweat, he immediately marched over to Madison and gripped her arm entirely too hard. Preston watched the entire exchange. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He was a smart man, raised in a family that survived by observing the things people tried to hide. He saw the sheer panic radiating from the Vale family whenever I was in the same line of sight as his father. For the first time all night, Preston looked at his new wife and saw a stranger, a woman standing on top of a mountain of secrets. The pieces were all on the board, aligning with terrifying speed. Russell Carlyle had recognized my voice from the hospital. Douglas Vale owned the logistics company responsible for a catastrophic medical failure. And right now, the Vales were desperately trying to use this marriage to merge that tainted company with the pristine Carlyle empire. The audience in the room, completely oblivious to the impending detonation, clapped along to the music. But the real question hanging in the absolute center of the room was undeniable if Russell recognized me as the nurse from that specific, horrific night. How long would it take before he realized that the man he was about to sign a multi-million-dollar merger with was the exact same man who had nearly killed his wife? I stepped back into the suffocating warmth of the grand ballroom, my mind still reeling from the discovery in the dimly lit study. Before I could even attempt to blend back into the shadows near the catering doors, a towering figure blocked my path. It was Russell Carlyle. He had left the head table entirely, his imposing frame casting a long, heavy shadow across the polished hardwood of the dance floor. The surrounding guests, sensing the sudden magnetic shift in gravity, quieted down. Their eyes darted nervously between the notoriously ruthless billionaire and the quiet woman in the simple blue dress standing before him. He looked down at me, the anger and the profound grief warring in his features finally settling into a sharp, piercing certainty. "I need to ask you one specific question," Russell said, his voice carrying an unexpected gravelly weight that instantly commanded the attention of everyone within a 30-foot radius. "Did you work the night shift at Kingswell Regional Medical Center in the dead of winter, exactly 2 years ago?" I felt every single muscle in my body pull taut, snapping like a drawn bowstring. The memory of that horrific, blood-soaked night, the very same one that had just flashed through my mind in the hallway, flooded my veins with a fresh surge of adrenaline. I met his unwavering, intense gaze and nodded slowly, refusing to break eye contact. "Yes, sir. I did." Russell closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a heavy, shaking breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for 24 months. When he opened them again, the cold, calculating businessman was completely gone, replaced entirely by a desperate husband who had once stood on the precipice of losing his entire world. "My wife," he said, his voice thick with an overwhelming emotion that forced the nearby high society guests to lower their crystal champagne glasses in stunned, absolute silence. "Evelyn Carlyle. She was brought into your trauma bay that night with acute respiratory failure. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the nearest tables. Everyone in the affluent Charleston society knew of Evelyn Carlyle's sudden, terrifying health crisis 2 years ago, though the exact details of the incident had been fiercely and expensively guarded by the family. Russell did not look at the crowd. He spoke to the room, but his words were an offering, a solemn testimony delivered directly to me. "It was pure chaos," he recounted, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, commanding a silence so absolute it felt physical. The emergency room was overflowing with severe trauma cases. The monitors were screaming, and my wife was turning blue right in front of my eyes. The transport ventilator they used to bring her in had failed completely. I remember the absolute terror of that helplessness. I remember the attending doctors panicking, the hospital administrators rushing into the bay in their expensive suits, everyone shouting over each other. They were frantically trying to shift the blame, whispering about legal liability and protecting their pristine institutional reputation, while the woman I had loved for 40 years was suffocating on a sterile gurney. He took a step closer, his eyes shining with a fierce, reverent gratitude. "But there was one nurse," he continued, his tone filled with absolute awe. "One nurse who flatly refused to panic or bend to their authority. You never left her side. You manually pumped oxygen into her lungs for 3 agonizing hours. And when the administration tried to quietly roll the faulty equipment out of the room to hide the evidence, you physically stood in the doorway. You demanded, with senior doctors screaming at you, that they record the exact time of the mechanical failure, the precise sequence of the medical interventions, and the specific serial numbers of the machine that almost killed her. You forced them to document the truth." The atmosphere at the surrounding tables violently fractured and rearranged itself in a matter of seconds. The very same people who had laughed at Madison's introduction 20 minutes earlier were now staring at me with wide, undeniable reverence. The wealthy investors, the political figures, and the elite socialites looked at my cheap blue dress and saw the impenetrable armor of a woman who had stared down a corrupt hospital administration to save their patriarch's wife. I was no longer the pathetic punchline. I was the untouchable, fierce savior of the Carlisle dynasty. "Oh, please," a sharp, desperate voice cut through the heavy, sacred reverence of the moment. Madison pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd, her perfect smile now looking incredibly strained and entirely grotesque. She grabbed Preston's arm, trying to pull her new husband forward, though he remained rooted to the spot as if his shoes were made of lead. Scarlett is always so dramatic. She loves to overreact to every little thing in the hospital to make herself feel important. You know how these frontline workers get. Russell. They exaggerate everything for attention. Russell slowly turned his head to look at his new daughter-in-law. The look in his eyes was so profoundly cold, it could have frozen the Atlantic Ocean. "I assure you, Madison," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper that sent a visible shiver down her spine. "I am not mistaken. I was standing less than 3 feet away while she kept my wife tethered to this earth. Do not ever speak of her dedication as an exaggeration again." Madison physically recoiled as if she had been struck across the face. But it was Preston who delivered the final, devastating blow to her perfectly constructed reality. He stepped away from Madison, his handsome face completely ashen, all the color draining from his cheeks. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, world-shattering realization. "My mother kept a recovery journal," Preston whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "She wrote about that terrifying night every single day for 6 months while she healed. She never knew your name. She only ever referred to you as the nurse who never lied to me." Preston looked slowly back at Madison, his expression twisting into something bordering on pure disgust. The woman his bride had just publicly humiliated, the woman she had dragged into the brilliant spotlight for a cheap, cruel laugh to entertain her wealthy friends, was the anonymous guardian angel his own mother had prayed for every night. The entire room waited with bated breath for my response. Madison had unwittingly handed me the perfect, sharpest weapon to destroy her right then and there. I could have gloated. I could have thrown her cruelty back in her face and demanded an apology on her knees before her new, powerful family, but I did not. I kept my posture flawlessly straight and my voice impeccably calm. "I did not do anything extraordinary, Mr. Carlisle," I said softly, looking back at Russell and ignoring Madison entirely. "I simply did my job. My patient needed me to advocate for her when she could not speak for herself, and the equipment was failing. I was just fulfilling my duty. I did not claim glory. I did not ask for a reward or validation. And it was precisely that quiet, unwavering humility that finally broke Madison. I watched the horrible realization dawn in her perfectly contoured eyes. She had built her entire existence on manipulation, on demanding constant attention, on screaming her worth to anyone who would listen. She could not comprehend a power that required no volume at all. For the very first time in her pampered, cruel life, Madison Vale looked at me and felt genuine, paralyzing fear. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that the ground beneath her expensive designer heels was rapidly crumbling, and the entire ballroom was tilting violently, permanently out of her control. The paralyzing silence that had gripped the grand ballroom shattered the moment Madison's fingers clamped around my wrist like a polished steel vise. Before the surrounding guests could fully digest the magnitude of Russell's public revelation, she forcefully yanked me away from the blinding center of the dance floor. She practically dragged me through a set of heavy mahogany doors, shoving me into a secluded, dimly lit bridal parlor just off the main corridor. The room smelled sickeningly of aerosol hairspray, spilled champagne, and wilted white orchids. Madison slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the brass lock with a sharp, violent click. The angelic, radiant bride who had been charming venture capitalists just 10 minutes prior completely vanished. Her face was flushed a chaotic, mottled red beneath her expensive makeup, and her chest heaved with unrestrained fury. "You absolute parasite," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that bounced off the mirrored walls. "You planned this. You knew exactly who they were, and you deliberately waited for my wedding day to exploit their worst trauma. You just had to play the noble, self-sacrificing victim, did you not? You could not stand the fact that I was finally winning, so you weaponized a tragedy to steal my spotlight. I stood perfectly still, smoothing the fabric of my dark blue dress where she had wrinkled it. I felt no anger, only a profound, clinical detachment. I did not bring up the hospital, Madison, I replied, my tone deliberately flat and devoid of the emotional reaction she was desperately trying to provoke. I did not ask to be introduced to the most powerful family in the state as your personal punchline. You built the stage. You handed me the microphone. I simply refused to read your script. Before she could launch another screaming accusation, the brass doorknob rattled aggressively. The lock clicked open from the outside, and Douglas Vale stepped into the parlor. He looked immaculate in his tailored tuxedo, but his eyes were calculating, cold, and utterly devoid of paternal warmth. He took one look at his frantic daughter and then turned his icy gaze to me. "Go back out there, Madison," Douglas commanded, his voice low and utterly unyielding. "Smile, talk to the caterers, and do damage control. Leave her to me." Madison hesitated, shooting me one last look of pure hatred before she slipped out the door, leaving me alone with the man who had systematically erased my mother's presence from his empire. Douglas stepped closer, invading my personal space in a classic corporate intimidation tactic. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly polite, yet it carried the weight of a loaded gun. "Let us be exceedingly clear about what is going to happen next. You are going to quietly collect your coat and leave this property. You will not mention another syllable about Kingswell Regional, the emergency room, or Evelyn Carlyle. If you attempt to slander my family or disrupt the financial proceedings of this evening with your dramatic hospital stories, you will find yourself tangled in so much severe legal trouble that you will never practice medicine in this state again." The blatant, aggressive nature of his threat struck me like a physical blow, but it also illuminated the entire dark landscape of the evening. A normal father of the bride would be concerned about the social embarrassment of his daughter's cruel joke. He would not threaten a registered nurse with career-ending litigation over a 2-year-old medical emergency unless he was deeply, fundamentally terrified of what that specific emergency represented. He knew about the faulty ventilators. He knew about the failing equipment. He knew far more than a disconnected logistics investor ever should. I met his cold stare without blinking. "I never signed a non-disclosure agreement with your logistics firm or the hospital administration, Douglas," I stated, watching a microscopic muscle twitch in his jaw. "And my clinical memory is flawless. I remember exactly which corporate representatives rushed into the trauma bay that night, desperately trying to simplify the equipment failure records before the state regulators could arrive." Douglas's face drained of color. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered businessman beneath the tuxedo. He opened his mouth to deliver another threat, but a faint, unmistakable sound stopped him cold. The heavy parlor door had not closed completely when Madison left. Through a narrow, 1-inch gap, the warm light of the corridor spilled onto the carpet. And standing perfectly still in that sliver of light was a man in a black suit, Preston Carlyle. Preston was close enough to hear every single word. He stood frozen, his posture rigid with shock, as Douglas practically snarled his final, fatal sentence. "The post-wedding contract cannot and will not be affected by an emotional nurse trying to settle a petty family grudge." Douglas turned abruptly and stormed out of the room, completely unaware that he had just broadcasted his true priorities to his new son-in-law. Preston did not confront him. The groom simply turned on his heel and vanished down the hallway like a ghost, carrying the damning truth that his marriage was nothing more than a contractual buffer for a guilty corporation. I waited 2 full minutes before leaving the suffocating parlor. When I finally stepped back into the periphery of the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had mutated into a tense, whispering battleground. The cheerful waltz had been replaced by a low, rhythmic jazz piece, but very few people were dancing. Near the towering arched windows, I spotted Russell Carlyle. He was standing in a secluded corner, speaking with intense, hushed urgency to a sharp-looking woman wearing a tailored navy suit. I recognized her from the society pages as Mara Keene, the Carlyle family's notoriously ruthless lead legal counsel. I watched Russell gesture sharply toward the head table, his face a mask of furious determination. He was giving her a direct, absolute command to halt any impending announcements and immediately audit every single document connected to the Vail corporate portfolio. The merger was being frozen in real time. As I navigated through the labyrinth of silk-draped tables, I could feel the divided weight of the room. The rumors were spreading like a wildfire through dry brush. At several tables, older guests and Carlyle relatives looked at me with quiet, profound awe, viewing me as the silent savior who had protected their matriarch. But at other tables, the hostility was palpable. Madison had wasted no time deploying her bridesmaids to spin the narrative. I caught snippets of venomous whispers as I walked past claims that I was a bitter, impoverished stepsister, intentionally exaggerating a routine hospital shift to ruin a beautiful wedding out of sheer jealousy. My car keys felt heavy and sharp inside my small clutch purse. The exhaustion deep in my bones screamed at me to walk out the front doors, hand my ticket to the valet, and drive far away from this toxic, glittering snake pit. It would be incredibly easy to simply disappear into the coastal night, but a fierce, unyielding instinct rooted my feet to the floor. I looked at Madison, who was currently laughing loudly with a group of investors, desperately trying to project an aura of total control. I knew how people like her operated. They relied on their victims walking away out of exhaustion or embarrassment. If I left now, I would surrender the narrative. Madison and Douglas would control the story, painting me as a liar and sweeping the truth back under their expensive rugs. I tightened my grip on my purse and walked deliberately toward an empty chair near the bandstand. The stage was set. The final act was approaching, and I was absolutely not leaving until all the lights were turned on. I could not hear what was being said behind the drawing room doors, but I did not need to. Russell Carlyle had gone in furious, and he had taken Mara Keene, the one person in the room whose face suggested she lived for buried liabilities and ugly numbers. Through the narrow gap each time the door shifted, I caught flashes of a tablet screen, legal folders, and Preston's ashen face near the velvet curtains. Whatever Mara had found, it was bad. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed inside my clutch. I expected a routine message from the hospital. Instead, I found a secure email from Arthur Vance, the semi-retired attorney who had once handled my mother's estate before Douglas pushed him out. Attached was a notarized codicil to Joanna Owens's will. I read it twice because the first time did not feel real. My mother had set aside a protected trust for my medical education and living expenses. Douglas had not merely overlooked it, he had hidden it. As the words settled in, the entire night rearranged itself in my mind. This was never just cruelty, it was strategy. Madison and Douglas had spent years making me look small, unstable, and easy to dismiss because the truth was too dangerous if anyone powerful ever decided to look closely. I slipped the phone back into my purse and looked toward the drawing room again. Russell had not gone in there as a mildly offended father of the groom. He had gone in there as a man finally seeing the structure of a lie. And somewhere behind those doors, that lie was coming apart. The jazz from the bandstand kept playing, but by then it sounded absurd, too light, too polished for the tension pressing down on the room. Madison stepped back into the center of the floor and reclaimed the microphone with the desperate confidence of someone trying to outrun a collapse. She started talking about gratitude, sacrifice, supporting roles, the kind of language that sounds generous until you realize it is aimed like a blade. Then she turned toward me. "Scarlett, darling, please, come back up here." The photographers lifted their cameras before I even moved. She wanted a picture, a performance, a final version of the story in which I smiled on command and confirmed the role she had written for me. So I walked forward, but when she opened her arms, I stopped short. I did not hug her. I did not smile. I just stood there. The room felt that, before Madison could recover, the drawing room doors opened behind her. Russell Carlyle walked out with a microphone in his hand and the kind of expression that makes people stop pretending. Preston followed a few steps behind, and whatever was left of his wedding night composure was gone. Douglas saw them and immediately signaled for the contract portfolios anyway. That told me everything. He still thought money could outrun truth. It could not. Preston intercepted the coordinator before the documents reached the signing table. "Stop right there," he said. "We are not signing anything tonight." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the band's amplifier hum. Then Douglas made his worst mistake of the night. He came for me. He grabbed my arm and announced to the room that I was unstable, overtired, and needed to be removed. I did not fight him. I did not have to. "Take your hand off her arm." "Douglas?" Russell's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. Douglas let go. And then Russell told them. He told the room what had happened to Evelyn Carlyle. He told them Vale Nexus had supplied the failing equipment. He told them the hospital records had nearly been buried. And he told them that the nurse Madison had mocked in front of Charleston society was the same nurse who had kept his wife alive long enough for the truth to survive. No one laughed after that. Mara Keene stepped forward and confirmed that every deal tied to the Vale network was frozen pending a forensic review. Preston looked at Madison the way people look at ruins they had mistaken for monuments. She tried to speak. He would not let her rebuild the lie. Within minutes, Russell, Preston, and the legal team were walking out of the estate, leaving the contracts unsigned and the entire room staring at the wreckage Madison had created with her own voice. Madison was left standing entirely alone in the center of the brilliant spotlight. For the very first time in her pampered, highly calculated life, she was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet she possessed absolutely no control over a single one of them. The orchestra was dead silent. The applause was gone. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of her own exposure. I did not smile. I did not step forward to gloat. Nor did I hurl any insults. I did not need to stoop to her pathetic level. I simply reached into my small clutch purse, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of my phone screen where my mother's hidden will codicil securely waited. I looked at Douglas, who was now staring at me with the emptied-out stare of a completely ruined man. I finally understood why he had spent over a decade trying to make me feel small. He was utterly terrified of my integrity. I turned on my heel and walked out of the ballroom, my head held high, leaving the ruins of the Vale family suffocating in the toxic ash of their own lies. The final aftermath arrived exactly 3 months later. Douglas Vale was officially stripped of his corporate titles as the State Commerce Commission launched a massive, highly publicized investigation into his logistics contracts. The Vale Nexus empire completely collapsed under the crushing weight of a dozen gross negligence lawsuits. Madison lost both the multi-million-dollar merger and her precious social crown, becoming an absolute pariah among the elite circles of Charleston. She was forced to retreat to a small, rented condominium, her custom designer gowns gathering dust in a closet she could barely afford. As for me, I returned to Kingswell Regional Medical Center. I put my scrubs back on and went back to the trauma bay. But the hospital was profoundly different now. Russell Carlyle made a massive, unsolicited donation to the emergency department, officially establishing the Joanna Owens Nursing Fellowship. He named the educational grant after my mother, ensuring that the very profession Madison had so arrogantly mocked was permanently honored and heavily funded for generations of medical workers to come. Standing in the bright, sterile hallways of the hospital, I realized the ultimate lesson of that opulent, disastrous night. I did not win because I yelled louder, or because I had more money in my bank account, or because I possessed a crueler heart. I won simply because the quiet, uncompromising truth I had fiercely protected on a freezing night shift finally found the exact audience it was meant for. And in the grand, echoing mansions of Charleston, things changed forever. From that wedding night onward, whenever someone in high society carelessly let the phrase "just a nurse" slip from their lips, the entire room would fall dead silent. They would immediately remember the dark blue dress, the shattered wedding cake, and the terrifying night when one arrogant, dismissive remark brought an entire dynasty of lies crashing down to the floor. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can chat and share our thoughts together. And do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.